We lean into extremes because the nuance is terrifying, because unfortunately, if we accept the nuance, we have to accept the fact that there's not as much survivors can do to protect themselves and protect themselves from it happening again as we'd like to admit. We spend so much time, even within our justice system, pretending like these things only happen to girls at parties with malicious
Yeah.
people. We treat serial abusers the way we treat serial killers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, we don't recognize, like, the hardest person to be believed, get justice, get helped is a wife.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to season 2 of the Bare and Brutal podcast, the podcast where we bare our feelings and are brutally honest. Each week, we get the honor of hearing from incredible guests who share their personal stories of resilience, of failure, of transformation, and just very real firsthand accounts of exactly what it means to be human. I'm your host, Michelle, and thank you for tuning in. We're so glad that you're here. Today, we have a remarkable guest, Noelle Cope. Noelle is a multi-talented poet, actor, and screenwriter living in LA. She has lent her acting talents to major streaming platforms like Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, you name it. Beyond her professional achievements, though, Noelle bravely shares her personal journey of surviving emotional and sexual abuse and how she is reclaiming her power through poetic justice. She's here to discuss the misrepresentation of rape in media, her struggles with PTSD, and her book, Notes from the In-Between, which serves as a resource for survivors, for supporters of survivors, and honestly is just truly a work of art. I got the honor of reading it myself, so I can attest to this. We're honored to have her with us to just shed light on these crucial issues and share her story of empowerment and advocacy. So welcome to the show, Noelle.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to get to dive into all these things.
I know we have such an agenda today, but I would love to just start off with your background, your career. Can you share a bit about your journey? I know you were originally from Colorado, right?
Yeah.
So how did you land yourself in Los Angeles, living the glamorous actress life? Tell me about it.
Yeah, so I originally grew up in a really tiny town in Colorado. I think the local population was like a little over 1,000.
Oh my gosh.
So very small town, very different from LA in many, many ways. But yeah, I grew up there. It was a little town Telluride. And then, of course, I decided that I wanted to work in the movies and just like convince my parents that like we have to move to LA. So when I was a teenager, we moved out to LA and I started pursuing everything here. But yeah, very, very different culture. And that's something I'm hopeful in future writing projects to really dive into. But like in the first section of my book, I think a lot of my Colorado versus LA identity is explored. And one of the
Yeah.
themes of the book that I found very interesting is this idea of like home and what is home and how your feeling of home
Mm-hmm.
impacts your identity and
Yeah.
impacts how you may stay in places where you're not actually taking care of yourself and
Mm.
different things. And so I think definitely I've learned a lot in the past couple of years of how much I need to integrate a lot of the elements of self that I think I
Mm-hmm.
allowed to be more free in childhood and in
Yeah.
such a relaxed, easygoing small town.
Yeah. So, how do you define home? I mean, do you think of Colorado as like your home base or where you are
You
now?
know, I think the thing that I continue to find is that there's like kind of two different senses of home. And the second you leave someplace, your idea of home expands and it no longer
Mm-hmm.
becomes a single place. I think there's a lot of truth too, which is something that's mentioned in the book, is like home is where the heart is. I truly believe that
Yeah.
because suddenly you'll find that you can find the magic and the beauty anywhere if you get to share that experience with someone. So like
Right.
the idea of home, I think for me at least, always comes back to connection. But in that, I think I've also been growing and expanding to maybe home isn't just where the heart is as far as other people. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
home is where the heart is as far as how much I feel like myself and I love myself.
Mm,
And trying
yeah.
to find, as I've been healing, that duality of home shouldn't be about a singular person and how exciting it is to share my life with them. Home should also be how exciting it is for me to share my life with myself in this place.
Yeah. Wow.
So it's very interesting. It's very like multi-layered, and it's something I'm still starting to unpack and unravel, which I think is one of the more beautiful sides of healing from these type of
Mm-hmm.
things. And I think even if you haven't had anything traumatic happen, if you've just had a breakup, I think it's very much a part of just a normal self-discovery after the loss of something that you put a lot of
Right.
your identity into.
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine that writing and this passion for writing and acting has played a part in your healing journey. Can you talk
Definitely.
about that, and how did you discover that you even had a passion for these things?
Definitely. So I grew up very lucky. A lot of people in my life have always been creative. My dad's a very creative person and a writer, and my mom is very creative, not necessarily with the written word, but in her own way. Like growing up as a kid, we were always watching HD TV and doing home renovation because that's where my mom's creative energy came out, was learning new techniques for like painting the bathroom so it looks stucco and, learning how to like stain the deck certain ways for certain things. And so I've always grown up with this idea that everything around you can be creative and be creative expression. And I didn't know as a child, obviously, that I was using that as forms of self regulation, as forms of meditation, and all these other ways of kind of like working with my body. Because when we're children, we're given, I think, a lot more time to be creative. And it's very encouraged because we can see behaviorally with children how when they're tapped into that creative flow state,
Mm-hmm.
they're you're able to communicate with them in ways beyond their years. Their maturity levels are kind of peaking at that moment because they're their happiest and their
Yeah.
brain is in its most receptive form, but also their communication skills. Like when they're painting, you'll realize for a few minutes afterwards, they're really, really easy to be around. And,
Yeah.
they can still be fussy or not like things, but they're in a you're helping me solve the problem mindset versus I'm going to lash out at you because you're the one that's like telling me no.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I was just very lucky that I was never forced to grow out of prioritizing creativity.
Yeah.
And so like when I was 7 years old, I decided to like write my first book because I suddenly discovered, like, I don't know, I was like 7 years old. Like people always told me like, oh, so and so's a writer, and I didn't get it. I finally got like, oh my God, like somebody sat down and had to write my favorite book.
Yeah.
And all those like stories that I tell myself in my head to fall asleep at night, I could write those down. I could
Yeah.
share them with other people. Like, hold on, because I would like be the kid that would like lie in bed and I do like my own recreations of fairy tales. And, I'd always redo it to make it where it's like more exciting for me. And I remember even in kindergarten, like the only time I really got in trouble was because the substitute teacher got really tired of the way that I played pretend. Because I would wrangle like the bunch of the boys, and the boys like to play with me when we couldn't do outside recess. We could only
Mm-hmm.
do inside playtime. Because I would always like make us play the most dramatic game. And my favorite game was always, hey, let's play fantasy. I was like, so you'll be a knight and you're going to die. And then I'm the princess who's in love with you, and I'm going to be really sad and I'm going to cry. And they'd be like, okay, let's do it. And they'd get to always like different boys would pick their different death scenes, and then I'd pick my different. And at that point, because I was already obsessed with like acting and not even like the performing, I was obsessed with like the emotional exploration.
Mm-hmm.
And already being, I guess, 5 years old, I was very fixated on grief and
Yeah.
emotions and these big things. And she got really tired of it, especially because there's this one boy who his version was always that he like fell off a horse and that's how he
Mm-hmm.
died. And so I started crying, and then she was like, okay, you can't do this. I don't like this game. You guys are very distressed. I don't see you guys having fun. And he tried to prove I'm having the most fun. I was like, I am having a blast. I was like, and also that was really bad. I don't feel like I was in it. Can we go again?
Let's take another take.
Take another day. Cause I would just like watch behind the scenes with my dad because he loved, movies and seeing all of that. So I was always watching behind the scenes. We had friends that worked in the industry, like, and they had like their second home in my town. So I was just like, yeah, this is how you do it, guys. Like,
Yeah.
we gotta, I gotta match the level.
She didn't
of
understand the
teaching.
vision. The substitute
No.
teacher did not understand.
And so then she came back with notes and was like, how about he doesn't die? And I was like, okay. Like, so he loses his leg. And he was like, oh my God. He loved the idea of trying to be an amputee. And she was like, no, he keeps his limbs. So I was like, okay, what tragedy could happen? I was like, because the horse died. And then we're both like, wait, no, that's too tragic. So, and so we're like, no, it has to be to him. Because he's like, I want to be able to do something dramatic. And she was like, no. We're like, can he break his leg? And she's like, fine, but play something else. And then she tried to separate us, and we both realized that breaking the leg was just not it. So we waited until our teacher came back, and then we continued to play these
You needed
really.
more drama. You needed more drama. That's it.
She didn't get the way that we were discovering and exploring things. We were yes anding through the
Yeah.
worst of circumstances.
Well, I love just hearing you talk about your childhood. I mean, these seem like really core memories for you. The fact that you can even think back to being 5 years old, 7 years old, and these experiences that you had, it's so clear. I mean, look at the woman you are today. You're literally doing the thing that you're doing since you came out of the womb, basically. So
No,
I love that.
true. I was very melodramatic at 9. I like watched like the behind the scenes and became obsessed with like the Chronicles of Narnia. And I
Yeah.
literally had this like epiphany watching them talk about how they needed to design the White Witch's costume and the thought process and how they worked with Tilda Swinton for it.
Yeah.
And being melodramatic, I was like, because all 9-year-olds are melodramatic. I was like, oh, I'm never going to be happy if I'm not making movies. It just like went off in my head. I was like, oh, my happiness will be contingent to making make believe worlds. It was like
Yeah.
clear as day. And so ever since then, I started to like bother my parents and be like, I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to write books and I'm going to be in movies. I'm like, that's
Yeah.
it. That's the plan.
There's no other option.
And they were very supportive since the beginning. So I was very
Yeah.
lucky. They were like, this is a doable dream.
Yeah.
Hard, but doable.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think it's so important to tap into children's curiosities. And I feel like it's easier, right? Like you said earlier, it's
Mhm.
easier to do that with children. And then somewhere along the lines, you grow up and they're like, no, now it's time to be realistic. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to college and we're going to do this. And
Totally.
that's a little bit too out there, honey. So let's maybe dial it back down. So I love that you grew up in an environment that encouraged your curiosity and supported just going after something.
Yeah. No,
That's
I got really
amazing.
lucky. I think my parents had a lot of faith in me early on, and I don't think they ever felt like my dreams had to be super profitable because I think I
Mm-hmm.
see that a lot. And in LA, you very quickly see which friends are forced to grow up a lot younger and which friends aren't. And the biggest thing that kind of determines that a lot of times is how much money the child can earn for themselves. Because the second you're able to start earning a massive amount of money for yourself, or even a decent amount of money, it really changes how much realism is forced upon you,
Mm,
which I think
yeah.
is really sad because I'll, meet kids that are like 8 years old and they're all like, well, I have to, whatever, a very intense, very adult situation. And they're like,
Yeah.
because, I'm the one that's making all the money for my own future. And I'm like, you're
Mm,
8. Don't you want to play with dolls? And they're like, I don't have time to play with dolls anymore. And I'm like, why? And they're like, because I'm on set or I'm doing on set tutoring. And by the time I'm done, I have to memorize lines for another self tape. And then I have to, see friends. And I'm like, so what do you do with your friends? They're like, well, we're off in an acting class together. And I'm like, do you touch grass? Can you play with
yeah.
sticks?
Like, when
Can
is
you like
there
paint?
time?
They're like, well, I can do it if I'm doing it for like an AP class. I'm like, you're 8 and in an AP class, honey. You're like, do you want a doll?
Wow.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, when you tack on the monetary responsibility to something that you're passionate about, I think it's easy to take away the joy out of it. Like, I think nowadays we don't have hobbies anymore. Like, it's we don't
yeah.
have we don't do things just for the sake of the enjoyment of it. Like, I found myself in that trap too. I mean, this is completely unrelated, but I started crocheting at the beginning of this year and I loved it. Like, I was literally just a little old grandma in my corner, would turn on TV and just start
Oh yeah.
crocheting little animals. And then I was like, oh, maybe I can monetize this. Like, maybe I can make some money out of it, post it on Instagram or something. And then I was like, man, what am I doing? Like, then I started stressing about, okay, maybe I need to go to markets and do this. And I'm like, well, I just want to do
Do
something
it.
without, yeah, And I think we get into that trap where maybe we don't always have to monetize
No,
our
and that was something
hobbies.
that
Yeah.
was very hard, and we can tie it. If you give me a second, I'll tie it all back to the main topics of this. I grew up with a family, especially on my mom's side, who was very hobby focused, very based.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother, on my mom's side is Hungarian. She's from a very tiny village. She's 95 years old. And that is a world in which hobbies and things were a necessary part of life. And they were how you
Mm-hmm.
did art and culture. Like this pillow behind me is traditional Hungarian folk art. And
Uh,
embroidery is such a huge part of our culture, not for monetary purposes, but for aesthetics and
yeah.
beauty and tradition. And, with that comes other things like knitting. Like my grandmother used to knit when she was able to. And growing up my whole childhood, my mom was always knitting. And my mom's like, I don't care if I ever wear it, it's good. And then when my mom was going through chemo and got early onset like arthritis in her hands, knitting was the only thing that helped relieve any joint stiffness. And so, at 7 years old, I was like, I'm going to learn to knit. And so I started picking up knitting and painting and baking. Like I was a 4-H kid and all these different things because my mom had more of that old world mentality of you learn to do these things for your self esteem, for your
Mm-hmm.
confidence, because you're meant to do things. Like my mom, her whole childhood, my grandmother was always like, oh, I want you to take fencing and tennis and these things, not to be good at it, not to be a coach, not to professionally train people, but because we do really well in life as people when we feel very well rounded and when we get
Yeah.
to try new things. And there is something about trying and having to fail for a while that actually, in my opinion, builds self esteem
Yes.
because we have to let go of the idea that it's failing and instead get excited over the fact that we are showing up for ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and like repeatedly showing up when we're not good at something
Yeah.
is a great way to show ourselves self-care. And something that was very hard in the relationship that's the topic of my book and that really opened my eyes to a lot of things was very early on. He was a figure who's incredibly negative and harsh about anything I did that I loved that was not monetary based
Mm.
and could not understand. And like whenever I talk about how I adore embroidery, like I did not embroider this, but I'd make my friends like really elaborate with like shading embroidery
Mm-hmm.
style pieces of like their favorite cartoon
Oh,
characters, or I'd make like
wow.
quotes and things.
Yeah.
I just did it because I loved it and it was pretty and it was a great thing to do while watching TV. Or I'd knit scarves. I'd make like
Yeah.
I one year I'd knit like a bunch of stuffed animals for everyone, like every person who's like kid. And it's a very hard thing because immediately one of the red flags for me at least was the way I was like talking about this one time. You see, I get excited, I'm passionate, I love it. And he's just
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, I don't know. I've just never understood the point of just doing something with your hands just to do it. He's
Yeah.
like, I'm not into the crafty things.
Mm.
And I'm like, okay, yes, it's a craft, but it's not like I'm sitting there with random, and even if I was just sitting there painting like glasses from the Dollar Tree, if I'm really connecting with it, there's a lot of me in it. I don't think it's just like a
Yeah.
crafty thing. I think it's something that brings me joy. And so
Yeah.
he could never understand and he'd get annoyed if I like brought my knitting over and was like knitting when we were watching TV. And not even from like it's bothering me sight wise. He's just like, I don't get why you invest money in this. Why do you do
Yeah.
this? I was like, first of all, I get my yarn on sale.
And
Also,
I
second of all,
also
sir, you're
think,
not hurting for money. Why do you care?
yeah, but also if your partner genuinely enjoys something, like why do you need to understand it really? Like
Yeah.
I understand maybe being curious, like, oh,
Yeah.
what is
Curiosity,
it?
beautiful.
Yeah. But the judgment of like, why are you doing that? I definitely a red flag. And
Yeah, and not even
I,
waiting for an answer as far as like
yeah,
why do you do it? Just immediately, I've just never understood crafty things.
yeah.
I
But
think
not
it,
even putting in the effort to try to understand too.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into us going straight for it,
yeah,
but talking about your personal experience in this relationship and the challenges that you faced. I think that's something
yeah,
that could be really helpful to hear,
Totally.
for us to recognize signs. Do you mind walking through like
Yeah,
what were some of
no.
the red flags that you from the beginning of the
Oof.
relationship? I
Yeah,
know you're
no.
like,
Oof.
where do I start? There's a long ass
Well,
list.
because I think it's a very hard one. And I think it's a part of the conversation that we haven't until honestly the past year and a half been ready to have. And I even like put it here because it's true. This is the first book in my entire recovery that I've read. It's called It's Not You. And I don't want to mispronounce the writer's name, but it's called It's Not You, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but I do apologize. She is a beautiful Indian woman, and that's just not a dialect native to me. Rami Dursvula, I think is her name. She's an incredible psychologist, and this book is predominantly about surviving narcissistic abuse, but a lot of it is still applicable to people who survive emotional abuse because narcissistic abuse is a form of
Yeah.
emotional abuse. One thing that she talks about in this book is the fact that you don't have to be considered super susceptible in the traditional sense to experience this. If you're dealing with someone who's an experienced abuser, their red flags are going to be much more concealed because they've already been through this. They've already been through the fallout. They've already learned from people what their red flags are. And they are also someone who spends a lot of time generally around people who are very authentic, very genuine, and they see how that opens doors. And I think you don't have to be a narcissist to kind of pick up some of those skill sets. And I think, there's some people that are very convinced that they're not as harmful as they are. And so it's very easy in the onset of meeting someone to really lean into the best that they have to offer. And we all kind of naturally do that. We don't sit there on the first date unless you're kind of like me. And sometimes you do lead with the crazy and talk about kind of like our biggest character faults, right?
Yeah.
And so instead we will kind of lead with our best foot forward and make a good first impression. But it can be very hard with specific people because the red flags are very under the table. They're very guarded. They're very covert, extremely, extremely covert. And they're oftentimes something that they can explain. So with something that also when you like someone and you're getting a lot of attention and they're offering you a lot of the things that you have been looking for, and it seems very organic and real.
Yeah.
It can be very easy to listen to their explanations and not listen to your own internal logic. So very early on, probably by the time it would have been the second date. And even again, interesting beginning, I couldn't tell if we were or weren't dating for the first two or three hangouts because it wasn't explicitly said. And he had already, when we were just kind of being friends, made it clear that he's not the type of person, which again, interesting situation. He's not the type of person who kisses or expects kisses or any kind of physical contact on the first date. He's like, I think that
Okay.
puts women in a really uncomfortable position because they just met me. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
So again, when someone leads with that, and like we had talked because one time we were hanging out, and a friend had called him and texted him, and she was like, oh my God, it's the first time I was able to like say no to a kiss on a first date, even though I enjoyed it, just because I didn't want to say yes. And if I didn't want to, and so he was just really talking to me, like championing her and being like, he's like, obviously, if a girl goes to kiss him, he's like, and I'm feeling it, I'll do it. He's like, but I don't consider that necessary because it can be really awkward. I was like,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's like, honestly, I agree. And that is something that a lot of people, I feel like in LA more than other places do, is there isn't a physical expectation on the first date of any nature, even like a kiss goodnight. So I, being on the younger side of all of that, was very attuned to that being more normal. So like I couldn't tell when we had like a very fancy dinner and he paid for it all and then we didn't kiss. I was like, okay. So I have no way of gauging if this was or wasn't a first date. And in between that and me scheduling the second date with him, he had posted some things online that sent up red flags for my best friend. My best friend was like, I don't like this. And I was like, I hear that. I was like, but he and I have actually talked about exactly what he was posting and what he's been going through. And she was like, I'm getting a weird vibe as far as how he feels about women. And she was like, I'm starting to get, he's got an axe to grind. And I was like, I think he's just hurt. Me being able to, because
Yeah.
again, when you have like a 2-hour dinner with someone, they give you the details that they're not posting.
Yeah.
It's very easy to be like, I think he's just dumb and doesn't know how to use the internet, as
Yeah.
far as like how to post and bridging the gap between public figure, but also wanting to update friends. And
Mm-hmm.
in hindsight, I can definitely see very, very clearly what was alarming, but I can also hold space for what I didn't know. And so, there were other red flags and there were other things even within the first time that there was physical intimacy of being like, this is not not ideal, but he's older, so there's all these things of like, okay, I can like I can take a lot of the blame and figure out like, okay, maybe I didn't explain things that were maybe generational gaps or
Mm-hmm.
gaps because of, my friends and I being so very progressive and a lot of the guys in my life being very much on what unfortunately I consider to be like the cutting edge of consent and all these things. And
Yeah.
so, but again, all of that also came with, as the book really demonstrates, these intense highs of just this deep romance and this connection and the way that this person was able to hold space and understand parts of me that were never easily understood. And it'd be things like, even if he didn't understand why I craft, which wasn't something that I learned later into dating him, he really like instantly understood how I navigated the industry. He understood my creative drive. And like the first thing that kind of caught his attention about me was the way that I talked about screenwriting and scripts. And, he was the one who like asked for my number. He was the one who, out the gate was very much pursuing me.
Mm-hmm.
And it all seemed to be for the right reasons with the right interests. And again, with abusive people, they can be,
Yeah.
they can be going with appeal and interest. And so it wasn't until 3, 4 months into actually being in a relationship with him that I started to really become aware of the extent of how unhealthy things were. And at that point, things had already started to not be great as far as how much I was seen and heard, including in respect to my own physical well being.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, it's very hard because you're suddenly in this very deep conflict of
Mm.
feeling a Jekyll and Hyde. And so it's one of those things where it's like, we'll sit there and be like, oh, you're super vulnerable to this because you don't love yourself. I am someone who's had a normal amount of insecurity. We all go through it. I live in LA. It's bound to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always also kind of been a bit of a jackass and a little delulu in this, in the sense that I'll sit there and be like, yeah, I'm not the most talented, but I'm pretty good. Like I'm good enough to get into like X level classes or, I'll be like, I'm not like the most beautiful, but there are pictures I really like of myself. And you know what? I would date me. I would ask for my phone number. So I think that's a good enough. Well, and so it's just like a lot of that, which in media, we're constantly shown that the girls that end up in this place are the girls that have no agency. They don't speak up for
Mm-hmm.
themselves. They're women who have these intense daddy issues or have all these things. They don't know how to self love, or they're women who are so naive and so sheltered and so giving that I've unfortunately, as almost all women, you become aware of these issues and abuse and all these things around the same age that you start to really gain consciousness. You know people very, very early on who are going through abuse. You see the signs of someone who needs help very early on. And maybe it's more because I grew up in a small town and people were a lot closer knit, but it's not something that I went in like in a bubble and naive. And very early on in the relationship, there was already a lot of resistance and there's a lot of like boundaries and things I had in place. This was not something where I was instantly like, yeah, I'm going to go out with you and like do all these things. I was very much like, I move slow. I don't commit early
Yeah.
because I I'm always cautious. And I was cautious before him. I was cautious with him. But there was a lot of little things that I think I didn't want to hear how severe it was impacting me. And I was doing a very good job of taking the blame for things that weren't my fault.
Yeah.
and not realizing that my reactions that were very out of character for me weren't coming from a place of me being a bad person. They were
Mm-hmm.
coming from a place of self-defense and being triggered.
Mm.
And I think that that's something that's very hard because it makes you very susceptible to gaslighting and very much like, look at me, the abuser will very much be like, look at me. I'm still dealing with this. I'm still willing
Mm-hmm.
to put up with you. You're doing this because of XYZ.
Mm.
And, that only further led to me being more shut down and me being like, I'm not going to tell you anything about me. I'm,
Yeah.
I'm going to be very selective in what you know. And that should have been the first sign of, no, actually, as you get closer to someone, you should want to share more.
Right.
And you shouldn't feel like what you share is ammunition. But at the same time, he didn't weaponize things that normal people in my life would weaponize. Like he
Mm-hmm.
didn't pick on me for the things that my friends would pick on me for, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so in that sense, he felt very safe. Because it's like, well,
Mm.
the thing that I always have to tell everybody to shut up about, it's never a problem with you.
Yeah.
And so, and it taught me a lot about like ways I had accepted unhealthy behavior and patterns within friendships,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that that was kind of the closest indicator I had to my own pattern of letting people hurt me. But in friendships, I'd always kept people enough of a distance that it never actually deeply impacted me. It just made me distant.
So I'm curious, like you mentioned briefly, there's this power dynamic, right? I mean,
Yes.
there's like a huge age gap between you two. Do you think that that came into play a lot? Like, was that something that you were aware of at the time?
Yes, very. So I think the thing that a lot of women experiences, even when the relationship ends, the power dynamic doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of ways you have to be very, despite whatever happens, you have to be very careful with this other person's privacy. So I can answer, but to some degree, anything that might be telling of this person, I will keep it a little more on the vague side. But yes, there was an age difference. It was under 10 years. But I think I think when you are at a certain age, and especially coming right out of the pandemic and different things, it makes you a little bit more susceptible to feeling that and feeling the desire to like embrace your own adulthood. And so, you're on watch for your youth in interesting ways.
Yeah.
And a way that that came out really early for me was I was never very goofy in this relationship. And in being around lovely people and dating since this relationship, I realized that I am very happy and very content with the people that I can go on dates with and be an absolute ham, or people I can have conversations like this with. Like I'm someone who has a lot of levels and I want that. This relationship
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have that. So that was kind of like, even when we were just kind of friends, that was kind of the first thing that I noticed with him was,
Mm-hmm.
even when my friends were around, we all let that go to the back burner of our personality. Another thing is we run in similar enough circles, but with different status, and that impacts. And how many people that someone is connected to that are in a position to impact your reputation, impact your perception of work, your ability to get hired, all of that is very much a thing. And when you live in LA, I think a lot of themes of the Me Too movement specifically come up. And then the biggest thing for me that I caught really early was there was a deep financial discrepancy between us. There was a lot more money on his end and a
Mm-hmm.
lot more money that he was happy to put towards me and the relationship. And I've just felt deeply that I was like not comfortable with it. I was like, he took me on one very wild date, which he considered to be the first date. And I was like, that was beautiful. Love that. No. I was like, I don't, if I wouldn't be able to pay for myself, I don't want us to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I don't feel comfortable because you seem great. You seem awesome. I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to put myself in a position where I have to say yes to something when I want to say no because I feel purchased.
Mm, yeah.
I don't, I know you can sit there and say it's not transactional. You want me to have fun. You see how hard I work. I get it. And I get that you really enjoy spoiling me, but no. And that was something that I really feel good about having done because towards the end of the relationship, when I had to ease up on those things, because he was like, okay, We've gone out for a really long time. We've been through a lot. It's very clear that I'm not that hang up with money may not be as justified as you think. Can I start to? And then the gifts got lavish, and there were things like, I want to take you clothes shopping. And I was like, I don't want you to take me clothes shopping. And it was very hard to explain because I was like, I don't want your opinions on what I wear and how I show off my body or don't. How I dress when I'm at home with you, or how I dress when it's just us, or on date nights is one thing. How I want to dress when I'm with my friends is different because of
Yeah.
my relationship to my body.
Yeah.
And, and then there would be a lot of things of like, did you get me a gift because you did something that's going to make me cry?
Mm.
Or did you give me a gift because you actually thought of me?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And you can tell me you got me this because you thought of me, but I'm afraid that it's going to be like the other times you got me a gift and I'm going to be really hurt. But you're going to use this and me taking it as a way to soften the blow
Yeah.
and get me not to leave.
Yeah.
Because that was definitely my own worst trait in the relationship was I was pretty consistently trying to get out. Once things soured, I was always, and this comes from like, if you were to give me an attachment style, I'm an avoidant. Which again, we're always like avoidant people can't get abused. Plot twist, we're actually a group in a demo like everyone who can. It just might take on different forms. Um, because a lot of times people associate abuse with immense distance, but there's also the abuse that can happen within codependency and someone being very attached to you, and so you become very withdrawn. So that was mine was more like that, where I was just constantly like, okay, well, if you're gonna do this, I'm gonna go.
Yeah.
And it was a relationship that was very hard for me because I'm someone who I like to like I'll text bullshit all day long. But also if you don't respond to me, I don't really care because I mostly just want to like say it. When you get to it, you get to it. This was a relationship where very much similar to me always getting gifts at scary times. If I didn't respond to this person within 5 hours, I would get, I know you're angry with me. I know, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, yes, I'm not happy due to the nature of a relationship, but I'm not any more unhappy today than I was a week ago.
Right.
So no, I didn't respond because I'm upset. I work. I have a job.
Yeah.
I am with my best friend. Um, so there were a lot of ways that the power dynamic was very interesting. And
Mm-hmm.
again, it comes in many different ways. Even that, just kind of like the constant need to check in on me, know where I
Mm-hmm.
am, wanting me to be available to respond.
Yeah.
But then the power dynamic of money, the power dynamic of socializing, and a really interesting one that is complex. Like all of these things get more and more complex the more
Mm-hmm.
nuanced you go through it. And every relationship is going to be different. But one that a lot of people experience is future faking. And it can be really, really hard to tell when someone is faking their desire for a future and the extremities that it goes. And that was a theme that I noticed within my book came up a lot because all of the poems within my book were poems that I was writing during the relationship. I didn't go back and write poetry.
Yeah.
These are the things like I have photos of me in his bed
Mm-hmm.
writing in the notebooks that were used to write my book. And I didn't realize until reading back how consistent the future faking was. And to the point where today I'm like, I honestly still don't know if it was fake or if he genuinely just had these very intense mood swings of wanting a future with me and then not wanting it. And, he was indecisive about the relationship a lot too. And, there would be crazy things of if I was really struggling, of me suddenly hearing through the grapevine or through different people all of these things that he had said about me and these big dramatic behind my back displays of just like deep care for me and a desire for a future, me being like, that's okay. That doesn't add up with the person that I get behind closed doors. But
Yeah.
okay, you're telling.
Just hearing you talk about it, I can sense there's a lot of like cognitive dissonance. Like there's a disconnect from the person that you knew, like who he presented himself as to you behind closed doors, and then hearing other people, their impressions of him. It's like
Totally.
it
Well, one time
messes with your
he ran
mind.
into a work colleague of mine at like a thing that I wasn't at, and he texted me after and was like, "Oh my gosh, I ran into this woman who's very much an equivalent of a boss." And I was like, "Oh," and I was like, "Just so I know, like, did I come up?" And he was like, "I mean, like, we know each other through you." He's like, "But no, like, you didn't come up." And I texted her because I was like, "Okay, this is a great way to like stay friendly and stay on her radar." I was like, "Hi," and she's like, "Oh my gosh," and she was like, "He talked about you. It was so cute." And I was like, "What?" I was like, "He told me you guys had a conversation about growing old," and she's like, "Yeah, he was telling me all about how like you keep him young and you humble him." And she's like, "There's again for privacy, there was just a very like there's one way on his face that I always laughed because it was an odd inconsistency for age,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very like you have to be very very close to someone to spot it, and it's very intimate detail to be aware of
Mm-hmm.
even on someone's face. And he apparently told her all about it and how like I'm always laughing and I'm the only one who ever spots it. And I talked to him and she was like, it was so cute. Like she's like, it was like such a married couple. She was joking that the energy and the way he talked about me was, his version of what he told me was that like they acknowledged that they both knew me and then they just like chit chatted about how things were going and they just joked about getting older. And I assumed that was because of something going on in her personal life, not at all because he was telling this like thing between us and disclosing that, because again it was very much a thing where we were always like, oh, we're going to be really private about this, we're going to be, and again in hindsight how private someone is about you is a great red flag,
Yes.
because it was someone who I was strictly forbidden from posting. I could not comment on his posts, I could not tag him
Wow.
in anything, my friends were not allowed to. One of my friends
Wow.
got in trouble for on their own private, not even one of the main social media apps, a social media app that
Mm-hmm.
is no longer current. But my friend liked to use it. Has no mutual friends with him. Could not have been more removed. He was so incredibly upset that not just a photo of him, but a photo of him holding me in the background while another friend was doing like someone was doing something crazy
Mm-hmm.
in front of us and we're just in the background like hugging for a
Yeah.
second. Was so incredibly upset that this friend had allowed any images of him to be shared,
Yeah.
even privately. And
Wow.
so again, just we always talk about it because we're always like talking about it in terms of someone, cheating. We're always like, if they're keeping you a secret, then they're cheating on someone else, and so on, or they want the ability to cheat on you. But I think, in LA, we keep things very private. I keep my relationships private. I always have, not to the extent that he wanted to, but just because it's just not worth posting a lot of things and having to delete it and do all of that. Unfortunately, there is still, I think, a very outdated mentality that it benefits you a lot to appear very single because people will give you a lot of time of day. And so because I was like, oh yeah, this is just like a weird old school thing that none of us like, but we all lean into. And I was like, yeah, I don't need to do this. And I'm not one of those girls that makes my brand relationships. LOL. Recovering from relationships has now become my brand for the moment. So it's just kind of weird power dynamics like that. And the fact that he talked to a boss about me in that kind of way and all these things. But again, in private was very wishy-washy. And there was a lot of emotional like inconsistency. Like one minute he'd be sitting there and telling me, so when we have kids, they're going to go to this neighborhood. And what are your favorite kids' names? And what
Mm.
astrological sign would you want your kids to be?
Yeah.
And if we wanted to move in together, how soon would you want to move in with me? And also within these conversations was always encouraging me to quit acting.
Mm. Interesting.
And then there was a lot of conversations about how I should have been really appreciative of him wanting a future with me, despite the fact that I did not measure up to the women of his past.
Ew.
That was kind of that was mhm. That was the first, I don't want to be here part of the relationship. That was the first thing where I was like, I think I want to break up with you or stop seeing you, even because I was like, oh, you're still in love with your ex. And then as the relationship progressed, I have no clue if he's still in love with any of his exes. At times it's are to know, like, how much do you love anyone? Or are you just very obsessed with people that you like get close to you? Have a very hard time and you utilize relationships for your image. I was told more than once that I was not someone that the people around this person considered to be attractive. I was like, well, I can't help that. Yeah, other women that you've dated are considered more attractive, or your friends would want to date them. I don't want to
Crazy.
date your friends. And I don't know, maybe I'm old school, but
Yeah.
I think that you shouldn't want to date your partner's friends, and your partner's friends shouldn't want to
Yeah.
date you. Like, unless you're polyamorous, in which case
Yeah.
that's up to everybody to negotiate. But yeah, I'm
What the
sorry
heck?
that I was the least financially stable, the least successful, and also the least sexually attractive of your exes.
And he made it a point to make sure you knew that. Just
That that I
insane.
that I was very lucky that he did not perceive me the way
Yeah.
that the people around him perceived me.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of understanding of why the people around him perceived me that way, because, and got to the point where the women referred to by name, by achievement. And then, a couple of days later, he'd be really upset because he'd see on Instagram that I was like doing a writing session or I was recording, and he'd be like, why didn't you tell me? And I was like, I just think it's not something we need to discuss.
Yeah. And I want to backtrack a little bit because
Yeah.
I think it was so important where you highlighted not necessarily the misrepresentation of women who can get into situations of emotional abuse or be
Yeah.
victims of narcissism, but I guess more so the lack of representation for the range
Yeah.
of people who can be affected by this. Because I mean, you're right. I think for me, so I've also had my fair share of experiences with narcissistic abuse. And I think I will market myself as like the textbook daddy issues, anxious attachment style, didn't grow up, having healthy models relationships. And I think it's so interesting, though, and important that you highlight this can happen to anyone. I mean, you are a confident, like, good head on your shoulders, like you were aware in the time too, like, oh, this is a little fishy. Like, you understand how to create
Yeah.
boundaries, and this still
And at an
happened for
intense
you.
support system, I'm
Yeah.
extremely close with both. Like,
Yeah.
I've been through my fair share of life. I've got my sensitivities. I'm not going to sit here and be like, I've never, no. I've
Yeah.
stood in front of the mirror and cried over my appearance. I've
Yeah.
cried in acting classes because as a teenager, I was told I'll only ever get cast as the best friend. But like, I had to work through those things and
Mm-hmm.
develop and keep going back to but I like me.
Mm-hmm.
I think on a lot of self-confidence and things goes to but I like me. But we never see those girls depicted in media. And we don't ever see people like myself who will lean avoidant, who are hyper independent, who, because of having codependent friendships, enter dating with I need my independence. I need my
Mm-hmm.
space. I'm not no, no, like, I need my space from you, but I'm like, I feel really nice when I have time with me. I have spent
Mm-hmm.
my whole life cultivating a relationship with myself. Like, I'll joke with people. I'm like, I'm the funniest person I know, not because the people I don't know around me aren't funny, but because, my God, I have to entertain myself. I am stuck in my own brain 24/7. I better like
Yeah.
the person who's up there. And I think that just like also comes through a lot of like what I had to learn during COVID. You're stuck inside with yourself. And I was very strict. I was very cautious. I was very conscious. And so that gave me a lot of time to self reflect and decide how was I going to be me afterwards? And I think the media has a very hard time because the more that we show the range, the more nuanced it gets, the harder it is to have these conversations and pick up on it, and the more dependent it is on the people who've lived through it to tell these stories we
Yeah.
become.
Yeah.
And the hard part about that is, in my time since this, every woman I know who sees specific things from this person or other people, who hears about text messages, sees screenshots from him, or vice versa. I will
Mm-hmm.
hear how their abusive partner speaks to them, how their abusive ex speaks to them. I will see videos, I will see text messages, different things. You realize they all talk the same. You realize they all behave the
Mm-hmm.
same. And you will go and talk to supporters, or I will have people who read my book be like, that right there was
Yeah.
cathartic and triggering at the same time, because
Yeah.
oh my God, it's a pattern. And that's like the book that I mentioned, It's Not You, was just like very jarring. Or even a book which is very harsh for most survivors, and I don't recommend it for a lot of survivors, but for people who want to explore this topic and show up more for the survivors in their community, there's a book called Not That Bad. It's an anthology that was put together by Roxane Gay. And one of the reasons she put together is the number one thing survivors always say is, well, it's not that bad. And the truth is, we'll say that despite living with intense PTSD. We will have consistent nightmares.
Yeah.
We will have a very consistent thing where many of us have weird phobias around beds or pillows or
Mm-hmm.
cars or locations, all based on this person.
Yeah.
We will have triggers we're not even aware of until suddenly we are breaking down. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
we were triggered hours earlier, but did not have the space or the time to be able to accept it. And the whole point of Not That Bad is we'll sit there and we'll say, well, it's not that bad because I'm alive.
Mm.
It's not that bad because I know someone who had it worse.
Yeah.
It's not that bad because I only had one person. And we make up all these excuses because we don't have the structure to support us, saying that no matter if someone had it worse, no matter if we're still here, it shouldn't have happened. And it
Right.
impacts us far more than we wish it did. And the
Yeah.
book's really beautiful. And there was one part of the book that really impacted me. Was one survivor was discussing how she talked to another survivor, and they both opened up, realizing for the first time that they shared it. And the part that really hit me, because I didn't know how to explain how my PTSD and my trauma impacts me, is she said, do you ever just sit down and lose time? And that's the type of things we don't see in the movies. A lot of times the depictions, and again, I work in the industry and I love so many of the creatives that are trying to do this, but we see so many
Mm-hmm.
times the stories of women who get into another abusive relationship, become super sexually provocative, become hyper religious. We lean into extremes because the nuance is terrifying, because unfortunately if we accept the nuance, we have to accept the fact that there's not as much survivors can do to protect themselves and protect themselves from it happening again as we'd like to admit. We spend so much time, even within our justice system, pretending like these things only happen to girls at parties with malicious
Yeah.
people. We treat serial abusers the way we treat serial killers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, well, you shouldn't be out late at night. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do this. When it's like,
Yeah.
okay, but then at the same time, we don't recognize, like, the hardest person to be believed, get justice, get helped is a wife. Because we believe that the vows of marriage mean that you can't get abused, you can't get hurt,
Mm-hmm.
and that your partner, your husband, most definitely cannot violate consent.
Yeah.
Because you got married, that ring is blanket consent, and that's not true.
Yeah.
And so media gets that very wrong. But then there are some things that get it far more right. And I think it's important to also highlight that. Like for me, I still go back and forth on if I feel like violence and violations of consent should ever be shown.
Mm.
Um, but I think two things that got it really right, and I'm going to talk about the two different spectrums, is if you're going to show things, I think something like Lessons in Chemistry, the TV show particularly. First of all, the trigger warnings and the resources available provided by Apple TV, phenomenal. But they do such a good job of showing the nuances of PTSD, but also showing the fact that you can have gone through that and still be successful, still fall in love, still be married, still have kids, and it does not change the intensity of trauma you carry. And I think, another thing on the more of the emotional abuse side that got it really right was the film Priscilla by Sofia Coppola, which came out last year, which is about Priscilla Presley and Elvis. And that leans very specifically into coercion and grooming, but there's a lot of nuance in the power dynamic, the control, the status.
Yeah.
And it's like, you don't have to have been abused by someone of Elvis's level, though, to feel how small she, but also feel how special she had been made to feel. And so I think that those are both pieces that lean very heavily into the nuance in a lot of places where we don't normally see that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think some survivors would be very right in saying, like, still heavy-handed in some ways. I'm like, yes, but that's moving the needle. And again,
Yeah.
also making a survivor story about the survivor and not the man in their life going on a revenge mission.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking though, like the fact that we don't have any representation still of situations where people get abused in their relationship, right? And like the concept of consent. I mean, you mentioned earlier, but just, oh, well, your boyfriend, girlfriend, like y'all are in a long term relationship. So consent is built into it. What do you mean? Like you have to, that's still a thing. And I know from our conversations previous to the episode, I'm not sure if you want to speak on that experience of yours.
Yeah, well, it's something that not just myself, but others, you can't get the same, you're discouraged from doing anything to protect yourself or get help in any way that might be public, in any way but that might be judicial. Um, because they don't think that anyone will give you the time of day unless there was incredible documentation and violence, specifically violence, if it is someone you had previously given consent to, and especially if it was someone that you had ever been publicly out with, if you had ever been exchanged words like "I love you" and all these different things, because they consider it to be the fault of the survivor more than anything else. And it leans into a lot of things, which is, most women are actually hurt by someone they know. Most women are assaulted and raped. And again, you can get deeply into the nuances of all these things, of which is terrible. But if you want to do anything, you are better off letting them rape you and doing it in the most horrific way possible than taking care of yourself. Because if you take care of yourself, if you stop it, you protect yourself, but you can't take further measures. And even if you do take further measures, a lot of times, if it's someone you had a relationship with, if it's even a friend, you can get it all set up. You can get a court date, and then the court will change their mind because they're overbooked and it's not considered a priority, because the case is not considered to be one importance or priority, because they don't believe it to be from someone who will be a multi-offender. Even if you know that they've done this before, even if you believe you can get other women to join your case, it's not something that impacts society in the way we think it does, despite the fact that I feel like everyone should care. Because if you employ a survivor, their well-being, their ability to do work and be happy, show up, is going to be impacted based off of how much trauma they're living with. And that's not to say don't hire survivors. That's to say support survivors, because everyone will benefit. If the mother of your children is someone who has been through a lot of trauma, she will be the happiest, best version of herself the more safe she is and the more support she has for what she's already lived through. Which is also a great case in point of why we shouldn't let it happen.
Yeah.
We have this idea that if you live, if you're still able to procreate after, then the rape wasn't that bad. And I think when we look at, for instance, justice, at the time of recording this, the Shia LaBeouf case is very interesting,
Mm.
because there's the Shia LaBeouf FK Twigs case, and Shia LaBeouf's attorneys are now saying that she could not have suffered the damages she did and the emotional trauma because she was able to record an album after. And the
My
ability to
gosh.
write music and sing and perform, despite being a lifelong performer, is proof that she's exaggerating and lying in court about the severity of the harm. It's just not
That's,
true.
yeah. And in your own experience trying to seek legal action for justice, did you discover, are there any laws in place that address the nature of abuse that can happen in relationships?
It's so states to state specific. Timelines
Mm-hmm.
are very specific. The truth is, it all gets very complicated and very expensive. And yes, there are certain women who can do a lot of things, and there are limitations. And for some women, again, it all depends on the type of abuser and the profile and the resources and how well you know them and the situation that you are in, and even the person giving you legal advice. There are many women who are told, don't even try to get a restraining order. And that's in cases where there's a lot of violence. Um, because it can put you in even more jeopardy. You know, there are so many oddities and so many things that there, and the truth is we don't, to begin with, have a lot of support for women who are drugged and raped. We don't have a lot of support for women who are kidnapped and harmed. Like all these things, we don't. And you know, anything that you do as self-defense is used against you. And so, you know, you're discouraged from taking legal action. And to be truthful, even minors will never get many minors will never get justice, despite the fact the legal system is supposed to protect children in these cases, and they're considered many times to be the only demographic. Again,
Yeah.
getting help from all of these things, and sometimes for specific people, it can depend on the police department that you go to.
Mm-hmm.
It can depend on the hospital that you go to. The amount of unprocessed rape kits is still staggering. If you are a woman of color, if you are a man, you are transgender, if you are part of the LGBTQ community, if you are in a hyper religious community, household, places where abstinence comes before anything, in a place where
Yeah.
you would feel pressure to commit to a relationship with your rapist because you have lost your purity. All of those things do impact our legal system. That's not even getting to the fact of how traumatic the trial can be and how many women will receive strong encouragement from their therapists to never go forward because of how fragile they are. And telling them that even if you get justice, it might not do anything to help you feel safer. So, you know, it goes back to that thing of, unfortunately, we have to start within the survivor community to have effective healing and change. We can't, it's not going to start from the top down. And we have a system that is, unfortunately, in many ways built against us. And in many ways, you know, the United States, I feel like, is far more progressive than many other countries. We have one of the highest ages of consent globally at 18, which I feel is very necessary. And it doesn't take a lot of time being around an 18-year-old girl to see the type of men who prey on them. Or when a girl acknowledges that she is 17 and will be 18 in a couple of months, type of men that may start to get very close to her. And so it is very hard. And, you know, every state is different. And what is considered assault is different in every state. What is considered rape is different in every state. And again, for even people in the LGBTQ community, there are many places where it is in the definitions are entirely based on anatomy and what is done with anatomy to define it. And that defines your severity. And then again, documentation, proof. How many witnesses? Were there any witnesses? Who knew what? What were you doing with your phones?
Yeah. Just
Are there
so
other
many
people who've
different,
experienced this?
so many different layers that make it impossible for someone to get justice for themselves, legally at least.
And since releasing the book, that's been the biggest thing that I have learned is other survivors who've come forward to tell me how isolated they felt after being denied any opportunity or chance at justice or aid. And so many times survivors come forward to do that not for out of addiction or any of this, but because they want to help cut off access to other potential victims.
And I think what you're doing, you know, with your book and just the overall advocacy efforts, you're right. I think that it's going to start from the community of survivors, and we are one woman, you know, in an entirely broken system. And I want to talk about your book a bit more and
Thank you.
how it serves as this resource for not only survivors, but providing needed context, I think, for supporters too.
Yeah.
I mean, as I was reading it, I resonated so deeply with a lot of your writing, but objectively, I was like, oh my gosh, this would be so beneficial for me to give someone, like a loved one, to read so they can really understand the nuances like we're talking about and see how it's almost this like gradual, like coming up under your feet type of thing. Like it's not in your face like we see portrayed in media, right? And so anyways, I just wanted to
Yeah.
hear, like, I know that these poems were chronicled over a period of like 3 years. What inspired you to compile all of your writings, all these poems into a book, despite thinking, oh, this is never gonna leave my notebook, like the public will never
Yeah.
have eyes on this?
So, yes, I started going through my notebooks for my own sake. A couple of like the love poems at the time of writing them, I was like, oh, so romantic. I want to share it. But the heavier things, and if I was going to share them, I very much was never going to share them where there was context originally. This book came about as a complete accident. I was reading through notebooks partially for therapy and piecing together a timeline, and also I was putting together a different collection book of poetry. I had wanted to put together this one book since I was like 16. I had a title picked out. It was going to chronicle like girlhood, coming of age. So I finally sat down to do that during the writer's strike last year because I was like, oh, I've got time to put a book together. I'm not like acting or writing screenplays. Like I couldn't pursue that in a very professional capacity because of the union regulation. And so I went to do it, and I was trying to force these poems, because a lot of them were really beautiful and really impactful, into this other book. But I realized that this other book was losing its original vision and is very much becoming this story where there's this weird flavor of, is that abuse? Is that
Little
was
sprinkle in there.
yeah, I'm like, that's not what I signed up for. And I realized as I was getting more and more sad and frustrated and angry, hearing from other women around me who were living through this, as I was getting closer to other survivors, as I was seeing friends come out of it, or even grown women that I work with professionally open up to me about their experiences, I realized how tired I am of the silence, and how tired I am of the way this is handled and the lack of nuance, and realizing the men in my life who so badly wanted to support me, so badly wanted to understand me, had no way of doing it, because the only things they know are stories like, like The Gladiator, where it's all about you're supposed to go on like a revenge mission after, and not actually sit there and know how to hold a girl's hand. And like, do you hold her hand when she's crying about this? Like, what are the boundaries? What are the nuances of expectation and care? And so in putting the book together, I mean, there were hundreds of poems that did not make it into the book. There were many different versions of the book that were read by friends and family before deciding the final version, because I wanted it to be something that survivors would relate to, but not be overly triggered by and find it something unreadable. So that's why the depictions of anything very heavy and very violent are minimum and vague, and left a little more open to interpretation. But I also needed the people in my life who have not been through this but want to care for survivors in this way would be able to sit there and really dig in beyond media. And the most beautiful thing about it is I've had people who knew me during the relationship, which was a very unusual time to know me, because I didn't realize how in my triggered state I behaved erratically without meaning to. And not like, oh, I did crazy things. I just would like sit there and I'd be like, no, I don't need to talk. And then I just suddenly word vomit when I felt open. Like it created a weird social dynamic at times. And I constantly feel flustered and short of breath. And I came off very like I was wound up very tight. And I was very scatterbrained. And that's a big thing that I'm still dealing with, is before I used to be so organized and on top of everything. And now I'm kind of like, no, I'll stay on task, no, I'll stay on task, no, because the brain fog rolls in. And so the beautiful thing about the book is a lot of people were finally able to understand what brain fog feels like, what living in a body that forgets that time is experienced in more of a sequence. Because, for example, there'll be moments where I'll be doing something and then all of a sudden it'll be like this person's much more present in my life still than they are. And you have to remind yourself, like, okay, wait, hold on. And you have to ground yourself. And so the goal with the book was to try to start to introduce those concepts to the people around us and to friends of survivors. And the most beautiful thing is I have been reached out to and have people tell me, like, I bought this book for someone I know who went through this. And I've had women, men, non-binary folks of all different places say like that it opened their eyes up. I've had survivors tell me that certain lines or poems acknowledge things that nobody else has to them. And then I've also just had other friends really be able to relate to it. I've had friends that have been in relationships where there have been other betrayals, not abuse, but a lot of dehumanizing feelings or actions. I'd be like, this book has been the most helpful to me. And they're like, I know you went through so much worse. Your poems still touch on a conflict of love that we don't see a lot, which is how can you love someone who's not kind to you? And I mean, it's been really beautiful. It's a hard thing. It's hard for me to like talk about, because it's like, it's such a bizarre experience, and writing about it has been the best thing, and sharing the book with the world has been the best thing, because suddenly, even as today, like we're talking about this relationship and this person, it's not about them anymore. It's about healing and survivors, and how can we support this? How can we limit this? Because I don't want this to happen to another person again. It's not something I alone can change. It's not just on survivors. Survivors have to be the one to change the conversation, unfortunately. But that's also what I'm hoping the book will do, is be something where it's like, I don't know how to sit here and tell you about it, so here's a resource to go read it. It's like a lot of times they'll tell us specifically, a message that I feel like we've been very much told is, if you are wanting to unlearn something you've been taught in a very prejudicial society,
Mm-hmm.
don't go asking your friends who've lived through it what you need to change. Google, what are the best resources for someone like me? And so that's very much the goal of the book, is it's like, hey, here it is. And it's poetry because that's what I wrote during the relationship. It's not narrativized, it's not a memoir. It's poetry because it's meant for you to be able, like a song, to put it on
Mm-hmm.
yourself and find where it's authentic to your story so that the
Yeah.
people around you can hopefully do the same.
And I think it's such a heavy burden to put on survivors as the sole source of information, for survivors to be the one to tell you, hey, here's how you can support me. I love that you have created physical resource for people to come. And I can't imagine like having to constantly explain, yeah, this is what happened to me. This is my story. Like you can get so much fatigue from just having to literally chronicleize like all the trauma that you went through in a relationship over and
Yeah.
over, so that someone can understand your pain enough to be like, oh yeah, man, like change needs to happen. So I think this is such a great step forward to
Yeah,
helping
thank
survivors,
you.
one, but also creating an opportunity for people to take their own initiative in supporting survivors.
Yeah, because I mean that's very much, the goal on both sides is it's been beautiful. I had a guy that I had gone on like a couple of dates with in between, a time when the person who brought out the poems in me and I
Mm-hmm.
were not dating before we ended up getting intertwined again. There was so much he didn't understand, and he couldn't understand because even at the time of me ending things with him to get back with my ex, I couldn't verbalize it. I didn't know how, and I didn't know how to
Yeah.
explain, like, yes, I know he's not the best for me, but I love him. And reading the book, he was able to understand so much more and reach out to me and be like, I get so much more now. And even when I tried, to talk to him afterwards and be like, yeah, so the relationship was not good for me. He's like, okay, what does that mean? And then, he's like reading the book. He's like, it's heartbreaking. It's hard. And he's like, but I'm so glad that I got to know you better. And I think that that's ultimately the thing for so many of us, is getting to know someone better. And it's not easy because survivors live in such duality, especially if it's someone you were in a relationship with, because you're like, oh, I have all these great memories
Yeah.
that are also very sad, that are also
Yeah.
very rooted in these things. And different people have different relationships to that.
Yeah.
Some of us are able to talk about the good moments very happily, and other of us can never talk about it again.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no single way. And I think it's just patience and compassion and understanding that there isn't a logical answer to any of our emotional
Mm-hmm.
functions is the most important way to support a survivor.
Yeah.
And that's another area where the legal system fails, is they're trying to force logic onto something that has surpassed logic. Because if you want a logical answer, then the person should be asking is, well, why, when you know they didn't want this, did you do it? Why, when you knew that this would hurt them, would you go through with it? Because
You
after
can't,
somebody does that, logic kind of goes out
yeah.
the window.
You can't possibly sum up an entire experience in just one question like that. It's not straightforward. It's not black
Yeah.
and white. There's so much gray. um, what a beautiful way though to kind of wrap this up. I'm really appreciative that allowed me to read a copy of it.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm definitely going to purchase one myself, and I'm gonna purchase it for all of my loved ones because I want this needs to be out there for people.
Thank
And
you.
I guess the last question that I wanted to end on
Yeah.
was one, like you said, we need to focus more on survivors and their stories. Um, what, I guess, advice or guidance can you give to survivors who are struggling to find their voice, to get to a place of healing, kickstart the process? Um, I know everyone's situation is different.
I mean, the number one thing that I would say is you have to check 99% of the things people tell you at the door. Because a lot of the dating advice, a lot of the stigmas, they're not going to help you. And it's the hardest thing to do. You have to move on your own terms and conditions. And you have to accept that there are going to be many people who have very little tolerance for what you've been through. And that is okay. You don't have to hate them, but you also don't have to subject yourself to them. And that you don't have to keep your story a secret, but also you don't you don't owe it to anyone. you don't. If someone is not going to treat it kindly, if someone is going to blame you, which is luckily something I have not experienced, but if someone is going to, or you fear they might, you can take your time. Like there was one friend I was very concerned telling her because I knew she had hated him for a very, very long time. And, she was with a group of people who, her boyfriend actively was like, I never want to see that man. I don't know hardly anything, but I see how not okay Noelle is. And you put me in the same room with him, and I'm not going to be able to behave civil for long. He's like, because I've been around too many women who behave like Noelle is. And when they behave like that, nothing good is happening behind the closed doors. And she had to trust him on it. And I was very afraid to tell her because I was very afraid of getting a scolding and being told that any of it was my fault. And I was shocked because instead she broke down crying and she just was like, I'm so sorry. I cannot put into words how much I wish this was not true. What can I do? And she was like, I'm sorry for crying. I know you don't need to comfort me. I just don't know what to do because I am so sad. I am so angry right now.
Yeah.
And it's like, don't force it. Don't force yourself to get out there and date again. Don't force yourself into anything. There are help in so many more places than you would expect. It does get better with time. It will not be great every day, but you love yourself at the end of the day because you got out. And every day that you are choosing to honor that distance, honor that space, and you tell yourself the truth of what happened, you're doing everything you need to do to start healing. And, it's just another thing. It's going to be hard. There's going to be days where you feel like you're forever being punished for this and that this person is not getting any justice, is not getting any karma. It's not true. It comes around. And at the end of the day, that's not what it's about. It's about you getting better. And you are allowed to be angry and you are allowed to go throw axes or smash a plate or scream into a pillow. You don't have to be the perfect victim and the perfect survivor. You don't. Like, fuck that
Yeah.
shit. Pardon my French, but it's the only way. Like, I'm so tired of people feeling like they can't honor themselves because they weren't perfect.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Noelle, for coming on here today and sharing your story, sharing the insights that you've gained along the way. I have no words. I'm going to say more
Thank you.
words because
That's
I
what we're here
need
for.
to,
We love
but
words.
I'm just I'm truly inspired and your dedication to supporting survivors and advocating for representation and taking the step that we need towards getting the support that survivors need. That's amazing. And I just appreciate the work that you're doing and I'm grateful for
Thank
the
you so much.
time that you've shared with us today. So before we go, though, can you please tell the audience how they can connect with you and just learn more
Yeah.
about your work?
So my social media handles on all of the major platform, it's at Noella Cope, Noella Cope, Cope. And if anyone's interested in the book, it is available on my personal website along with a bunch of survivor resources that I have compiled. And my website is noellecope.shop. And then if you want to purchase the book in the United States, it is at tons and tons of beautiful independent bookstores all across the country. That information is also on my website, but you can give them a call. They will be happy to tell you or stock it for you. It's also available on Amazon, Barnes Noble. It is available internationally in Finland, Norway, Sweden, UK, Australia, Germany, and Canada.
Very cool.
So there are, and for those are all online retailers. I don't think it's sold in stores internationally yet, but you can search your favorite local online publisher. And I think there's one resource in Taiwan also selling it.
That's amazing. That's so great.
It's
Well,
all through the beautiful survivor community and the word of mouth the books received that has made it an international resource and accessible.
yeah.
So truly it's on everyone who has supported it, purchased it, reviewed it, that has made it something that people see the value in and want to help sell it and make it accessible everywhere.
Yeah. That's amazing. Well, those of you listening, if you'd like to stay connected with Noelle, follow along with her content, or grab your own copy of Notes from the In-Between, please go show her some love. You can find all of Noelle's socials and links, everything in the show notes. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And as always, I will talk to you soon. Bye.